Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are in listen only mode. Today's webinar is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Now I'd like to turn the call over to your presenter, Dr. Christine Hartley. Dr. Hartley.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. We are so pleased that you could join us today for what is officially our third annual webinar on methodology updates for the U.S. Census Bureau's population estimates. My name is Christine Hartley, and I'm the Assistant Division Chief for Estimates and Projections in the Population Division. This year, I'm joined by my colleague, Luke Rogers, who is the Senior Advisor for Estimates Development and Improvement. Today's focus is, of course, methodology updates for our soon-to-be-released Vintage 2023 population estimates. I'll begin today with some background on the Population Estimates Program, products, and processes. Then I'll revisit the circumstances that led to our major methodological change from 2 vintages ago, the creation of the blended base, and discuss how it shaped further updates to the estimates over recent years. Finally, I will hand things over to Luke to discuss the specific changes that were applied to the Vintage 2023 estimates. The Population Estimates Program is responsible for developing annual estimates products as per Title 13, Section 181. These are the official estimates of population and housing units for the Census Bureau, and they're used in countless ways. For example, they serve as the denominators for key statistical indicators, like the fertility and mortality rates produced by the National Center for Health Statistics, surveys, including the American Community Survey, Current Population Survey, and numerous others, all controlled to our population and housing unit estimates. They're a staple for planning at the state and local levels and factor into countless research projects in academia and across the public and private sectors. And although we at the Census Bureau are not involved directly in the funding formulations themselves or involved at all, the estimates are used in the distribution of trillions of dollars in federal funding. Every year, we build a time series of estimates that starts at the date of the most recent decennial census and extends through the vintage year, where vintage is the word that we use to designate that we're referring to a time series of estimates created with a consistent population starting point and methodology. The latest series of estimates, at least until tomorrow, are for July 1st, 2022, also known as Vintage 2022. Every year, we release estimates for over 80,000 areas in the United States and Puerto Rico. You can see here that our geographic detail covers the nation, regions and divisions, states and Puerto Rico, metropolitan and micropolitan statistical areas, counties and municipios, and finally, incorporated places and minor civil divisions, also referred to as cities and towns. The detail that we publish varies by level of geography, which is summarized here in this table. We release the estimates by demographic characteristics, age, sex, race, and Hispanic origin, down to the county level. And brand new for our upcoming Vintage 2023 estimates, this includes metropolitan and micropolitan statistical areas, for which we used to only release total population and components of change. So that's why that one is highlighted in yellow. Our estimates of total population extend down to cities and towns. We also publish estimates of the group quarters population by age, sex, race, and Hispanic origin for the nation, total group quarters population for states and counties, housing unit estimates for the nation's states and counties, round out our estimates products. As you see here in the release schedule, our estimates are published on a rolling basis from December through June of each year. I've already alluded a couple times to our inaugural release of Vintage 2023 estimates, which is scheduled for tomorrow. And this release will include estimates of total population, voting age population, and components of change for the nation, states, and Puerto Rico. This will be followed by total population and components of change for metropolitan and micropolitan statistical areas, counties, and Puerto Rico municipios in March, national population by single year of age and sex in April, total population for cities and towns, as well as the housing unit estimates for the nation, states, and counties in May. And then we'll wrap things up in June with our release of estimates by age, sex, race, and Hispanic origin down to the county level, and by age and sex for Puerto Rico and its municipios. This information is always available on our website. Either you can click on the big schedule link at the top of our landing page for the Population and Housing Unit Estimates website, or you can get there directly with the address shown at the bottom of the slide. Speaking of our website, I did want to highlight that this is the primary destination for accessing our population estimates, since they're not yet available through the data.census.gov platform. Although this is something that our Center for Enterprise Dissemination is now actively working to address. In the meantime, to navigate to our tables and data sets, you can either head directly to census.gov/popest, or from the census homepage, you can click on our surveys and programs, select population and housing unit estimates, and then from the menu on the left, you can choose data. Also, population estimates are available via QuickFacts tool, and finally, some of our historical estimate series can be accessed via the Census API or Application Programming Interface. Typically, we don't recommend the use of older estimate series since they're superseded by the most recent vintage, but there are some instances where it can be appropriate to use them. And as soon as data.census.gov can ingest our data, which we're hopeful will happen within the next year, we'll also resume publishing our current estimates via the API. Now I'll talk a little bit about the methodologies that we employ. For population estimates at the county level of geography and above, the POP Estimates program utilizes the cohort component method to measure population changes since the last census through the use of a variety of administrative records and survey data on births, deaths, and migration, which in demography we refer to as the components of population change. That is, for a given geography, the only way the population can change is for babies to be born, people to die, or for people to move in or out. Some of our data sources for this method include the National Center for Health Statistics, Internal Revenue Service, Social Security Administration, Defense Manpower Data Center, and survey data from the American Community Survey and Puerto Rico Community Survey. We also work closely with state demographers and other population specialists through our partnership group, Federal State Cooperative for Population Estimates, or FSCPE. The population base seen here in blue generally represents the date of the last decennial census. So for our current series of estimates, we begin with the April 1st, 2020 population, which consists of a combination of data from the 2020 census and other sources. And that's something that I'll be discussing shortly in more detail. Our estimates of housing units are also produced with a component-based method that starts with the most recent decennial census and uses a variety of survey and administrative data to estimate change in the housing stock, specifically in terms of building permits, estimates of non-permitted construction, mobile home shipments, and estimates of housing loss. Data sources include the Building Permit Survey, Survey of Construction, Manufactured Home Survey, American Community Survey, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency individual records on requests for disaster assistance. We can also incorporate data provided by our partners in the FSCPE if they have alternative housing components data, such as local building permits, certificates of occupancy, housing conversions, and more. We use 2020 census housing unit counts for our housing unit base. So these counts are invariant, which means that in the context of the Census Bureau's disclosure avoidance system, they do not have differentially private noise infused into them. And finally, at the sub-county geography level, population estimates for cities and towns are created by distributing the county population estimates to each place within the county based on the place's ratio of household pop to total housing units. We add that to an estimate of the population in group quarters to get the total resident population. We saw on the previous slide how we derive our housing unit estimate. Meanwhile, the household and group quarters-based populations are drawn from the results of the 2020 census with a small amount of differentially private noise infused into them to protect the confidentiality of respondents as per the Census Bureau's disclosure avoidance guidelines. Our general methodological approach each year is to revise our entire time series of estimates beginning at the date of the last census and up to the vintage year. So for example, the estimates that we're scheduled to publish tomorrow, the vintage 2023 series, include data for April 1st, 2020 and July 1st, 2020 through July 1st, 2023. And these estimates, as I noted earlier, will will supersede the estimates that we published last year in the Vintage 2022 series. From vintage to vintage, there are three types of updates that we may incorporate into the time series. First, the base population is updated each year to reflect legal boundary changes or other geographic updates. It may also be updated to incorporate the outcome of official census programs, such as the count question resolution, or changes to the method of how we estimate the base population. Then, as more recent or complete data become available, such as births, deaths, or the components that we use for our housing unit estimates, we use those to update the estimates of the components of change. We may also revise the methods of how we estimate those various components. What you'll see here is that data updates are more likely to affect the estimates for the most recent years of the time series, while method revisions generally affect the series cumulatively from the census date forward. Finally, we may improve our method of tying all of the components together and generating the estimate, and this type of change also affects the series from the census date forward. For Vintage 2023, changes fell exclusively into this first category, base population updates. And to provide some important context for those updates, I'm going to flash back a few years to 2020, when a calamitous combination of COVID-19, hurricanes, and wildfires interfered with the enumeration of the 2020 decennial census population. Specifically, those unique circumstances surrounding the 2020 census enumeration compounded changes resulting from the modernized disclosure avoidance framework, and the end result was that the 2020 census data that the POP Estimates program needed for our Vintage 2021 county level estimates base was not available. For the first time, we were put in a position where we needed to create some kind of alternative estimates base that was not exclusively drawn from the most recent census. One option that we had was to extend our Vintage 2020 estimates an extra year, which would create a time series that was built off the 2010 census all the way across the decade to July 1st, 2021. But we already knew that our estimate for April 1st, 2020 was lower than the results of the new census. So instead, we shifted our focus to ways that we could improve upon that Vintage 2020 estimate for April 1st, 2020 to develop that into our new estimates base. And the solution developed by POP Estimates staff, dubbed the blended base approach, offered just such an alternative by integrating three sources of data. The Vintage 2020 estimates, which again was the last series built off the 2010 census, 2020 census total population for counties from the PL 94-171 redistricting file, and the National 2020 Demographic Analysis, or DA, estimates by age and sex. And these are national level estimates for April 1st, 2020, developed by the POP Estimates program using an alternative administrative records-based methodology, and they are used to estimate coverage in the decennial census. So this graphic that you see here represents the original Vintage 2021 blended base, which was designed so that the April 1st, 2020 estimates of total population for counties matched the published results of the 2020 census. Of particular importance is the fact that in this model, we're using those totals from the census, shown in red, but demographic detail from Vintage 2020 and DA, which is represented in blue and green, respectively. This method that I just described to you proved effective for the Vintage 2021 base population, and it was also a handy framework for coping with the fact that a lot of uncertainty still existed around 2020 census data availability and what the path forward would be for the POP estimates. So at least this way, we knew that we had an adaptive model that we could continue to use and improve upon as needed. And beyond being adaptable, it turned out that the blended base presented some distinct benefits that we've talked about kind of at length in other presentations. In particular, the age data in the base aren't affected by the age heaping that's apparent in the results of the 2020 census at the national level, which you can see here in this population pyramid in red. If you are not familiar with this tool, what we have here is population in millions on the x-axis by single year of age up the y-axis, with males featured on the left and females featured on the right. Age heaping is a phenomenon that occurs when population counts for ages ending in preferred digits like 0 and 5 are higher than would be expected based on known birth, death, and migration patterns. And so that is what explains those spikes in the red 2020 census line. And then we also found that by using the 2020 DA age and sex distribution, that there was a somewhat mitigating effect on the persistent undercount of young children in the census data, because the vital records which inform the 2020 DA age and sex data provide excellent coverage of this population. And this translated into more children ages 0 to 4 in the blended base, which you can see here with the red census line falling beneath the blue blended base, and also more kids aged 10 to 14 who had been undercounted in the 2010 census and then aged forward in our cohort component method. So you see that here, where the blue blended baseline diverges from the green vintage 2020 line. The vintage 2021 blended base was very much a response to unexpected circumstances, and it was produced on a fairly condensed timeline. So once it was completed, we were able to begin looking for ways that we could improve upon it. And that's exactly what happened for vintage 2022. So if you tuned into this webinar last year, you heard about how we were able to incorporate household and group quarters totals from the 2020 census, how we expanded our use of the 2020 DA estimates by age from ages 0 to 85 plus to ages 0 to 100 plus, in addition to some key processing improvements. Every year, the POP Estimates program investigates ways to improve our components data and our methods for future vintages. And now that we were producing the base population with this blended model, we had planned a similar approach for the base population moving forward. However, on March 10th of 2022, the Census Bureau released official measures of coverage from the 2020 post-enumeration survey and demographic analysis. Findings showed that although the total population was robust, the 2020 census had undercounted many of the same population groups that we have historically undercounted while overcounting others. So this new approach to the base population had opened a door to building a better April 1st, 2020 estimate at the same time that these coverage measures were raising questions about the quality of the April 1st, 2020 count. The results of the census couldn't be changed, but it didn't take long for stakeholders, data users, and even government officials to turn to the POP Estimates program to find out what we could do to address coverage issues in the base population, a question that was regarded so seriously by census leadership that a special team was formed. And now I'll hand things over to Luke to tell you more about it.
Thanks, Christine. So the special group that was formed was dubbed the Base Evaluation and Research Team, otherwise known as BERT. And BERT is made up of a group of subject matter experts in the areas of population estimates, age and sex statistics, coverage measurement, race and ethnicity, demography, and disclosure avoidance. And BERT's real purpose is to research and inform decisions about what 2020 census data are going to be incorporated into the blended base. And also, BERT works with experts from other census projects to maximize its research efforts. These are projects such as the Demographic Frame and other Census Bureau-wide projects. So what progress have we been making so far? So the team has been meeting since March 2022, and that's why if you think of our timeline, vintage 2022 didn't incorporate any of BERT's research, and this vintage 2023 will be the first vintage to actually feature BERT's research findings. So it's really broken down into data research and coverage measure research. On the data side, we've been focusing on age, sex, Hispanic origin, and race. And these analyses have been comparisons to benchmark data, evaluations of change since the 2010 census, and looking at demographic plausibility. Specifically, research questions have focused on, do the data improve the blended base? And are there adjustments that we can do to these data that would improve the data quality for coverage issues or other patterns that are demographically unreasonable before we bring them into the blended base? As far as coverage measures go, our analyses have focused on the assessment of the methodology, and research questions have been focused on the design of these measures and whether or not they're fit for use in the base, and whether or not there are design changes or recommendations for 2030 which could increase the utility of these measures for the estimate space in the future. So research has progressed the most in the areas of age and sex, Hispanic origin, and the post-enumeration survey. And we'll be talking about Hispanic origin and the post-enumeration survey today, but we have released a blog about age and sex, which we'll have a link about at the end of this slide deck. But we have released some of our findings already about our age heaping research, which has progressed quite well so far. So speaking of Hispanic origin, we have been really focused on investigating the reasonableness of the 2020 census Hispanic origin data for use in the blended base, specifically examining the impact of changes on the ethnicity question, looking at benchmark analyses on the Hispanic household and group quarters population by age and sex, doing cohort change analyses since between 2010 and 2020, and reviewing the impact of imputations on the population, Hispanic population totals. So some of the recommendations that come out of this research is that the incorporation of the 2020 census edited file counts for the resident and household populations in the blended base is recommended. However, we need to do more research on the GQ population, and we need to continue looking at alternative estimates and reconcile the differences that we've been seeing between the CEF. And the CEF is the non-noisy version of the census data. So we still have more research to do on the GQ data. So taking this recommendation into consideration, we are able to incorporate county level Hispanic or Latino origin for the resident population from the 2020 census into Vintage 2023's blended base. For the PES, so the PES is a measure of coverage of the census by independently surveying a sample of the population. The survey estimates the proportion of people or housing units potentially missed or counted erroneously in the census. It features estimates of coverage for total household population at the state level and for limited demographic subgroups at the national level. And importantly, the PS target population does not include group quarters or remote Alaska. So coverage experts on our team, including PS staff, have been assessing the robustness of the PS results for the purposes of adjusting the population estimate space. And we also took these 2020 results that they've been working on and shared it with a group of outside panel of experts on November 3rd, where we did a expert panel that talked about all different methodological changes we were thinking of doing for Vintage 2023. So recommendations coming out of our PS and coverage research. Since the PS was designed to estimate coverage of the census by independently sampling independently surveying a sample of the population, it was not. Oh, so sorry. It was designed to estimate coverage of the census. It wasn't designed to be an adjustment for the annual population estimates. Therefore, after a year and a half of researching this issue, the PS staff and our coverage experts have recommended that we should continue to use the PS to inform and strengths and limitations of the 2020 census, as well as products derived from the 2020 census, such as the population estimates, but not use the PS to adjust the population estimates base. We should start planning early for coverage measurement program that can adjust the population estimates base just in case there are coverage errors in the 2030 census. So planning ahead for that as a just in case situation. Summary updates for the blended base, and these are the changes that Christine had mentioned previously that are more methodological, at least the first three. So we made a method change to update the distribution of the demographic characteristics of the Connecticut County equivalent planning regions. So in Vintage 2022, we're able to update our geographic region, geographic county or county equivalents in Connecticut to the planning regions, and we improved that method. We are also able to update our method of distributing the GQ population by type from Vintage 2020 by type and characteristics. This was an important change. And then finally, a methodological improvement was implementing a size threshold to the GQ population to improve how Vintage 2020 demographic characteristics are applied to the GQ population on the 2020 census when they're brought in. And then the fourth is one we've already heard about, which was incorporating the 2020 census resident population for the Hispanic Latino population. So as I said, we have a lot of information on this slide. We have the Coordination Dissemination Outreach Branch, which was shared in the chat, I believe. They're there to help with any questions about tables or finding any information about our products. The Base Evaluation and Research Team, BERT, which we talked about, will be, we're happy to answer any questions you might have about the types of research we're doing or the progress of our research. And then the website that Christine had mentioned where you can find our data products is featured, and the blog about our age heaping and the BERT research on the kinds of work we're doing on age is there. And then finally, earlier today, we released a blog that gets into detail about the PES research and the recommendations that I just discussed. That was actually just published earlier today. So I recommend you go check that out and give them a good read. And with that, I'm open to answering questions. Thank you very much.
Do you have some questions in the chat that we can start to address? Looks like one question, will the interstencils be done? There have been a few delays to the release of that product. To respond to that, we are expecting to have the file that we need to serve as the endpoint for the interstencils, the 2010 to 2020 interstencil series. Hopefully over the next month or 2 months at the most, and that would enable us to begin production of the product. So we're probably looking at a late summer, early fall release for the 2010 to 2020 interstencils.
I think there's a related to that. There was a question about whether or not you should use vintage 2020 to get year 2019 or vintage 2019 to get year 2019. Until the interstencils are released, the answer would be use vintage 2020, just because the most recent vintage supersedes the previous vintage. So I hope that answers your question.
Another question that we had come in, what time will the new estimates be published tomorrow? We're expecting them to be available at 10 a.m. barring any type of technical issue. So hopefully 10 o'clock.
So a question in the chat is it possible to know if the vintage 2023 estimates still have a certain degree of undercount or overcount? I think that's a great question and something that BERT will continue working on, and an important reason why BERT has to continue working on its research, especially since we haven't incorporated race from the 2020 census into our data. Also, how we've used demographic analysis data for age and sex. It's only at the national level. And as we start incorporating age sex data from the 2020 census into the base, it'll be interesting to see how that changes our data patterns, because right now we're really relying on vintage 2020 for our subnational age sex detail, which certainly isn't a perfect data source. So I think, it's a great question, and it just begs more research from us and future improvements. So we're always trying to improve the estimates and looking into those types of things, specifically because I'm sure there's ways we can make the estimates better.
Another question asking us to confirm whether there were any major changes to the estimate space this year. There were some processing improvements that included improving ways that we use GQ information from our vintage 2020 estimates to create distributions in the 2020 census GQ data that we use in the base. But one of the more prominent changes is that we are also now going to be incorporating 2020 census totals by Hispanic and Latino origin into the base population. And this presentation is being recorded and will be made available on the website. So if anyone did miss any of the key information, you'll have an opportunity to refer back to it. So that actually ties into another question that we had come in about whether race or Hispanic age sex data from the 2020 census are being incorporated into the population estimates. So at this point, for the county level of estimates and above, we are using the Hispanic origin data from the 2020 census, and the BERT research on age and sex and race is ongoing, and we're expecting to be applying the findings from the BERT research to future estimate spaces, which would be when you would see possibly race or age and sex data from the census being incorporated.
And to Ken's question, our vital stats team has been working really hard to bring in a lot more recent NCHS data. So as to what provisional estimates you're thinking of at the state level, I'm not entirely sure, but I do know that they've been working with NCHS to try to get the more recent files for the final data. And they've also been talking with FSCP to improve the process of how they've been working with their data. So there are definite vital stats improvements that they've been working on. However, Vintage 2023, I don't think features any new vital statistics changes. All those changes would have been in prior vintages. So nothing I think new would have been in this vintage. It was all pretty much base population changes.
Small clarification for the last response I provided about which 2020 census characteristic data we're using. I noticed that Beth H, you asked for information on the county level and below. Below the county level, we don't produce estimates by demographic characteristics, but you could refer to the American Community Survey for lower levels of geography by characteristics. So question, will Vintage 2024 incorporate more age sex data from DHC and demographic analysis? That remains to be determined, but it's a major part of our research right now. We are working on a file that would enable us to pull in age and sex data from the census. So stay tuned. We'll be releasing information on that over the course of the year as we're able to.
So for Connie's question, interested in your decision to use 2020 data for people of Hispanic origin in the estimates, because this population is significantly undercounted, but you have concluded that 2020 is better than continuing with the 2010 based estimates. Could you discuss this decision? When we look at the impact of including the 2010 or the 2020 census data, we think it does improve the quality of our estimates. And when you see them tomorrow, I'd be curious to see what you think. Please do feel free to reach out to us and give us your feedback. But in their analysis, our staff that are familiar with the Hispanic Latino origin data from the 2020 census, when they did their digging, they did really think that the quality of the resident population data and the household population data was definitely worth putting into the estimate space. So we took the recommendation, and I think when we look at the comparisons between the blended base from Vintage 2022 and the blended base that's coming out tomorrow, it definitely, I think, is an improvement.
A question on whether we can summarize the major differences between the Vintage 21 and 22 base population. I would say that the most significant changes included extending the data that we were able to use from demographic analysis. Instead of applying the age and sex distribution up to ages 85 plus, we expanded that to ages 100 plus. And there were also a handful of processing improvements. We also began using household and group quarters totals from the 2020 census, which enabled us to incorporate geographic updates. That was something we were unable to do in Vintage 2021. And there's a lot more information on that change from Vintage 21 to 22 that we can provide to you, and which would actually also be highlighted in this webinar from last year, which is still available on census.gov if you want to check it out. Another quick response here, any major changes to methods for estimating domestic migration? And the answer is no, not this year. There were no method updates.
Will this methodology also be used to update the counts for some other race and 2 or more races? Maybe Christine, do you know which methodology, the blended base methodology? So we are doing research on our modified race file, so I can talk a little bit about that.
That's what I think it's referring to.
So one of the reasons why race data isn't in the blended base right now is because we're working on creating a modified race file. For those of you who aren't aware, the estimates program uses different race categories than that are available on the census data. So the census data that you're familiar with on census or data.census.gov has a some other race category. which isn't in the estimates, population estimates. So what we end up having to do is we have a procedure, a method of taking people who responded some other race and redistributing them into the other OMB, Official Office of Management and Budget, race categories that are used by other statistical agencies in the federal statistical system. So that research is still underway. And that is kind of working hand in hand with the BERT research on the age heaping. So we're working on that. Once that file is ready and we're happy with how it looks in our reviews, it will also become the endpoint for our intercensal estimates, which we had talked about a little bit earlier, which will become a smooth time series between the 2010 census and the 2020 census. So a lot of different products kind of are waiting on this particular research, and including BERT. Because this will become a big thing that we'll work on including into the blended base, and we'll have to do some research on how to best incorporate that file once we have it. So we don't have it yet, but we'll have it soon, hopefully.
There's a question, what products will be delayed on race and ethnicity? I don't know that any products coming out of our program are considered delayed in terms of the annual population estimates. We're just still using race data from our vintage 2020 estimates. We're not yet using race data from the 2020 census, and this vintage 2023 series that we're releasing tomorrow, when we do put out the estimates by age, sex, race, and Hispanic origin in June, that'll be the first time that we're using 2020 census Hispanic origin data in the estimates. But otherwise, I don't think there are any other products that we can speak to aside from the modified race file that Luke just discussed.
Are CQR, so the count question resolution and post-census group quarters review results incorporated into the population bases for vintage 2023? Yes, they are. Which ones are included depend on when they were submitted to those respective programs. So they have to be submitted by a certain date before by time to give our geography division enough time to process them to get into our base. But we started incorporating those in vintage 2022 and vintage 2023 definitely will have those as well.
Okay, there was a question, can we speak about the updates where we implemented a size threshold for GQ, so the processing updates that occurred? That's something you could elaborate on.
Yes, so the size threshold issue it's an interesting problem. So when you have, now I'm not trying to get into the weeds too much, but when you end up having a very small group quarters population in vintage 2020, where we derive a lot of our population characteristics from, and then you try to apply them to a GQ population that was large in the 2020 census, it can create implausible distributions. So imagine you have 3 people in a GQ population in vintage 2020, but then there was an uncaptured GQ in our vintage estimates that was captured in the 2020 census, like a nursing home or something like that. And so now we're trying to create a age sex distribution or something out of 3 people when there's 40 people in that particular type in that county in 2020 census. So it just creates implausible distributions. So we did, we basically did some analyses to find the best threshold, which isn't that large, because if you imagine the GQ population by type in the United States, there's a lot of zeros, and just applied a threshold. So if it is below a certain threshold, it defaults to the state level distribution by type, so that it can find a larger population to apply distribution to that particular to the 2020 census. And the results of the reviews of that simulation and our reviews when we made that change were fantastic. It corrected a lot of implausible patterns that we were seeing. So I think it was a very good improvement for vintage 2023.
I think we have addressed all the questions that we currently have in the chat, but we can wait a couple minutes in case anybody thinks of anything else. Otherwise, you're always welcome to contact us at the contact information that Luke shared on the previous slide. Now, if we want to go back to that, you can reach us at pop.cdob@census.gov, or if it's specifically a question about the base evaluation and research team research, again, you can contact us at pop.bert@census.gov. So if you don't get an opportunity to ask your question today, you can reach out anytime. There's a question about whether or not we can capture the chat. I'm not sure how that works.
That'd be a good
Sam?
question for Sam. Yeah.
Yeah.
Christine, Luke, yes, the chat is captured and will also be recording and the presentation materials within about 3 weeks.
Oh, and there was an unanswered question about tribal communities. I don't know. I'm unable to answer, and I don't know who to ask to chat, but we can try to connect you. I would suggest reaching out to our CDOB email there, and we can try to connect you to the appropriate people.
Well, thank you all for being here with us today. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to seeing you again next year, roughly same time, same place for our Vintage 2024 Methodology Updates webinar. Thank you very much.
This concludes today's presentation. You may disconnect at this time. Thank you.